College Public Forum, a student production. Your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the panel, it is a privilege to welcome all of you in the viewing audience to the 177th program of the North Idaho College Public Forum. And on behalf of our panel, it is a very special privilege to bring to our campus this evening to discuss with you for the next hour the field of psychology, child psychology in particular, a very distinguished member of the faculty at Eastern Washington State College. Our guest is Dr. Robert Atwood. He was born in Utah. As far as educational background is concerned, he received a bachelor's degree and then also a PhD from Brigham Young University in the field of clinical psychology. At the present time, he serves as a full professor on the faculty teaching in the field of psychology at Eastern Washington State College. In addition to that, he's also a consultant to the Department of Vocational Rehabilitation, continuing high school area. Dr. Atwood, it's a pleasure having you on our program.
Thank you very much.
I also am very happy this evening to welcome back one of our regular panel members. To my far left is Mary Lou Reed. Mrs. Reed is most active in partisan political affairs in the state of Idaho, and she's certainly very well known throughout the Northwest in environmental circles for her work in that also. As to educational background, she has a bachelor's degree from Mills College and did graduate work in religion at Columbia University. Mary Lou, welcome back.
Thank you, Tony.
It is a privilege to also welcome as a visiting panel member this evening to my left, Richard Snyder. Mr. Snyder has a bachelor's degree from California State University at Northridge, and he holds a master's degree from UCLA. He is a member of the faculty at North Idaho College teaching in the field of anthropology and also psychology. And lastly, to my immediate left is Dorothy Schneider, who is also welcome to the program as a visiting panel member this evening. She holds a bachelor's degree and a master's degree from Northern State College in South Dakota. She serves as a member of the faculty at this institution in the Department of Education. Welcome.
Thank you.
We'll proceed to questions at once, and the first question this evening from Mary Lou Reed.
Dr. Atwood, you're specializing in trying to understand the hyperactive child, and can I begin at the beginning by asking you, just how do you recognize the hyperactive child? What is different about the hyperactive child?
Well, this particular child gets named more than just hyperactive. He gets named minimal brain dysfunction, minimal brain damage, hyperkinetic. And if you cut across all those labels and say, what is the single thing that identifies this child, often is that he's bugging or in some way annoying the adults and the peers in his life. So if I were to go into a classroom and say, do you have any hyperactive children, I'd immediately probably find a yes response, and then the teacher would make some comment about, this little boy is driving me crazy. He doesn't seem to mind. He doesn't seem to follow instructions. And that seems to be the characteristic that most frequently gets them identified.
You mentioned classroom. Does the hyperactive child become recognizable at an early age? Is this something that you can pick up as a parent at the age of 1 or 2?
Yes, some of the time. Some children, by the time they're 2, a parent will notice that they don't seem to respond the same way to punishment. They don't seem to respond the same way to giving them rewards. They don't seem to mind. They seem to be different children in many ways. But the parents will often say, well, this is just a stubborn child, or he's spoiled, or make some comment like that. And the child will be allowed considerable freedom. He can play outside. He can do things and kind of get away from the parents. He can get away from structure. And then all of a sudden, when he hits first grade, here's a structure provided around him, and the teacher says, you have to sit down now. You have to be quiet. You have to follow instructions. And so his getting into first grade often gets him identified simply because now he's supposed to perform in a certain way, and he doesn't seem to be able to.
To tidy up this background, do you consider, you say brain dysfunction, is this a brain damaged child?
That's something at this point we really don't know.
All right.
There are many ideas about how they develop, and at this point we just don't have good evidence to know whether or not this child is really brain damaged or not.
Thank you.
Mr. Snyder.
Dr. Atwood, to follow up on this idea of what causes hyperactivity, what role, if any, does the family environment play in the hyperactive child or causing hyperactivity?
Well, some experts in the area really feel like hyperactivity is taught by the parents, or there's some things going on in the home that produces hyperactivity. For example, the parents simply do not behave in any kind of consistent way, so the child is never taught what is appropriate or inappropriate behavior. And in that way, some authors feel and some experts feel like the hyperactivity is taught. Then we've also observed that in some other children, when something traumatic happens in their life, for a period of time they might become hyperactive. For example, if a mother died in the family, and the family is going through a process of reorganizing, this seems to trigger hyperactivity in some children. But it seems to also disappear once the family becomes reorganized and that trauma has disappeared.
If I may follow up on this just a moment, do you know of any role that genetic makeup or heredity might play in hyperactivity?
Well, again, we're not sure, but if you look at the families, especially the fathers, and you ask the parents of a father of a hyperactive child, what was your little boy like? Or what was your son like when he was a little boy? And they'll describe often the same kind of behavior that you're seeing in his son. So hyperactivity does run in families. Now, whether that's genetic or not, we're not sure. It could be that the father's simply passing on some behavior patterns that he learned as a small child. But it does at least in part support a genetic notion.
Mrs. Snyder.
Dr. Atwood, if a parent suspects that his child is hyperactive, what would be his first step in finding out whether the child really is or not?
That's probably one of the more difficult questions because there are not a lot of people around, quote, experts who really have kept up on this field or maybe are even interested in the field of hyperactivity. If you look at me, for example, as an expert, if I try and keep up in the field of psychology, I suddenly get depressed because there are 10,000 journals come out every year. I can't possibly read all those. So there aren't a lot of people around our community who've really kept up on the literature and have really worked closely with what we call a hyperactive child. So finding, quote, the expert to help you with the problem is really very difficult. And what you really need to do as a parent, or if you're in some other way in contact with a child you think's hyperactive, is to start asking questions. Who in the community seems to know something about hyperactive children? And keep asking that question, and what will happen usually is you'll start running into parents of hyperactive children. They say, oh, we went to this man, and this man. He wasn't of any assistance, but Dr. X over here seemed to really understand and know what the problem was about and was able to give us a great deal of assistance. So you really have to ask a lot of questions. There are some pediatricians who are just excellent in dealing with the hyperactive child.
I see.
They've had a lot of experience with them.
Mary Lou Reed.
Well, what about medications? Do you belong to one school or the other? Do you think that you should be giving drugs to the hyperactive child in order to make him or her more reasonable?
Well, this has been in a sense, an eye-opener for me. I've basically been against using medication as freely as we do in our society. You watch on the television and, you know, a pill will cure anything we have. It'll make a better marriage, better sex life. Almost anything will be cured by a pill. And so basically I've been kind of anti-pill. But with hyperactive children, I have seen such dramatic results from stimulant medication that I really have to support the notion of medication for these children. About 70% of these children seem to be helped rather dramatically by the medication.
Why stimulant?
Okay, why stimulant? Well, the notion behind this is that there's something wrong with the way the brain's functioning. And the stimulant kind of tunes up or tones up the brain in such a way that the hyperactive child can focus on the necessary elements in his environment and block out the rest. That's the way most of us operate in the environment. I'm paying attention to you right now. I'm not paying attention to the television lights and all the other things going on in the room. If I were a hyperactive boy, I'd be responding to you and then running over and pulling down one of the cameras and then doing some other things because I couldn't shut out all of these other objects in the environment. The medication seems to kind of tune up their cortex, at least that's the idea, so that they can really focus on the task that's important.
You mean the hyperactive child really can't control his own distraction?
Well, I wouldn't like to put it that he can't control. I think it would be probably more appropriate to say that it's very difficult for him to control the impact that the environment has on him. He seems to be easily distracted. It's very difficult for him to stay with one task. And
certain stimulants do tone up the cortex?
Yes.
Could the rest of us use these too?
As a matter of fact, yes. And they are used. If you check with college students and they've had a tough week, and you say, well, what did you do last night? You know, you look pretty tired. And they'll say, well, I went and got me some stimulants. And I did some reading under the influence of the stimulants. So a stimulant would help you and I perform a little better on some of the tasks that we have to do. But the hyperactive child has such a long ways to go in his performance in academic kinds of things that you give him the medication and his performance leaps so dramatically that it's astounding. The other interesting thing is other animals other than man respond to the stimulants also. So you can identify a hyperactive dog. Here's a dog that's dropped out of school in a sense. His parents won't even, or you know, his masters won't even try and train him anymore because he bites them all the time. He's just one of those uncontrollable dogs. You can give him the stimulant drugs. In 2 hours, he's a dog that you can pet without being bitten. The results are sometimes that dramatic.
Richard Snyder.
That's interesting. I was thinking, does hyperactivity occur in other animals? And you've answered part of that. Do you know of any other animals other than dogs that it happens?
I really haven't thought to look at other animals, but I'm sure that there are other animals that are hyperactive. Now that I think about it for a moment, I'm sure there are rats. Psychologists are always working with rats. And so what we do is breed rats that are teachable. And you can bring some of the wild rats out of the field in and try and use them in the laboratory, and they're like the hyperactive child that we're talking about. You can't work with them in the laboratory. You can't teach them. So we've actually, as psychologists, selectively bred rats so that they learn in kind of a classroom situation. So they're easy to handle. They don't bite you and so on.
Thank you.
Dorothy Schneider.
Other than medication, what sort of treatment is given the hyperactive child?
There are many things that are done. One of the, I think, most interesting and probably useful kinds of treatment is to train the people around the hyperactive child not to respond in a negative manner all the time, to try and look for the child's positive behavior and not always focus on the negative things he's doing, so that you attempt to reward him when he does the positive things and ignore all of the negative things that he does to you. And let me give you an example of this. In one of the grade schools that's associated with the college, there are large glass windows where you can watch the children in the schoolroom. So one of my graduate students watched these children, looked down at the children in the classroom, and he noted that there was one little boy that we would call hyperactive. He watched the behavior of the teacher in relationship to this little boy, and he found out that every time this little boy did something, quote, naughty, the teacher would walk down next to his desk and say, now don't do that. or sit down, or be quiet, or something like this. But she was walking down to his desk maybe 30 or 40 times a day, telling him to quit doing something that was negative. They looked at the amount of time he spent doing productive work in the classroom during the day. They found that he spent about 10% of his day doing productive work. Then my graduate student hung a red light down in the back of the classroom that he could turn on, and from up in his perch up above the classroom, he would observe when this little boy was doing something positive or at work. He would signal the teacher would then go down to the little boy and say, "Good, you're doing a good job." And she would ignore all of the negative things that he did. In 2 weeks, this little boy was performing at about 90% of the time in productive work, simply by rewarding him when he was doing positive things and ignoring all the negative behavior. Now, one of the problems with that model of treatment, is that these little people have become so expert at finding our emotional panic buttons that it's very hard to stay cool and not respond to them emotionally. So again, let me give you an example. I took one of these little boys in a restaurant, and I said, I think I'll get me a hamburger and a large drink. So I bought a quart drink, and you know, in most of the restaurants now they put half ice in and half drink, and a lot of people like it that way. I was sitting there kind of relaxed, enjoying it. He took his quart drink, reached over and poured it in my lap. Try not having an emotional reaction to that. Or try coming home, you've just laid carpet in your basement family room, and he's there stoking a little fire in the middle of the carpet. Or you bring home a $700 television set, and you come home, and there's big initials carved in the top of it. It's very hard to keep from responding in an emotional way to them, but that's one of the best ways of dealing with them. You just don't respond emotionally, this upset, frantic thing that we often do with them.
Dr. Atwood, some months ago we had Dr. William Glasser from Los Angeles on our program, and as a psychologist and also a consultant in the field of education, he talked at some length about children that he had visited in classrooms that were doing some of the things that you have talked about and the disruptions in class, and he contended that many of those were simply an attempt by the child to get the attention of the teacher and the other students, if they were really desirous of attention. How would you respond to his comments in relation to that, being in the field that you're in of hyperactive children? Is there two classifications we're talking about, or is he trying to describe it in a different way?
Well, I think there's overlap, and I would agree with him to a point. There are, I think, the hyperactive child that I'm talking about does do a lot of things simply to get people's attention. And they'd sooner have negative attention than no attention. But if you look at some of the patterns they've developed before they ever come to school, they're not able to compete successfully in the school environment. So they're dropouts almost from the first grade. So how are they going to get attention in the first grade? They can't compete reading, they can't compete many of the other academic things. So that reinforces more of the negative things that they're doing. So I'd say there's a great deal of overlap in what I'm saying and what Dr. Glasser's saying. I would contend, however, that there are some children that you and I would find almost impossible to control and to teach without some kind of medication. They do things that you cannot imagine. And again, let me give you an example. Parents brought a child to me 2 months ago who would take a lady's hairpin, spread it apart, stick it into a 110-volt outlet. He had burns on his hands from sticking that hairpin in the plug. Most of us would stop. This little boy continued to push that hairpin in the plug. And so I'm suggesting that some of these children, for whatever reason I don't know, I'm not sure, but some of these children are not responsive to pain like you and I are. They don't seem to pay attention to pain like you and I do. Some of them walk on broken legs, they play with broken arms, they do all kinds of things that suggest they're not the same as a lot of other children. Now, Dr. Glasser's ideas would still work with them, but I think you'd have limited, at least a more limited success ratio with them than if you were able to give them some medication.
Thank you. Mary Reed.
Dr. Atwood, does this suggest some sort of neurological damage? This would be an argument for some possible brain damage?
Yes, I think it does support, indirectly the notion that there might be some kind of brain damage. How do we get at that brain damage? We don't have tools that are really very refined at this point. And the kind of brain damage we're often talking about now in these children is what we call a chemical lesion. And that's really a rather sophisticated notion about what's going on in the brain. So we're talking not about a place where there's a hole in the brain or a dead spot, but we're talking maybe about some of the chemicals in the brain being a little out of balance, so the messages can't get across freely.
Well, is there some feeling that these children do not metabolize in quite the same way? I was interested in reading something about, is it food coloring that they're evidently very sensitive to, and that there are other food products that you have to be careful with a hyperactive child?
Yes, there's a Dr. Feingold that's been on a number of TV shows. He's written a book recently about hyperactivity and reaction to food additives, particularly coloring. And he suggests that children have an allergy. Some children have allergies to these food colorings, and this kicks off the hyperactive behavior, this allergy to food coloring. I've read his book. There isn't good scientific evidence in his book about it. There's some case studies. I wondered about the idea. I went down to the grocery store and tried looking through all the things in the grocery store and seeing how many things had food additives in and coloring and so on. And I came back really astounded. I couldn't find any food without additives of some kind in. So we're dealing with a very complex chemical thing. When you try the treatment he's talking about, he's saying all you have to do now to cure these hyperactive children is take them off the foods with food coloring in. And he's convinced that that's the best thing to do with them. However, if you take them off the foods he's talking about, you're also taking them off sugar. And so some other experts have said, really, what you're talking about here is the problem with sugar metabolism, not the problem with food coloring. So we're kind of left up in the air again until there's some good research done in this area. Fortunately, it's my understanding that the Federal Drug and Food Administration is finally getting around to looking at this and looking at food additives and so on in relationship to hyperactivity in children.
Well, are there any other indications like blood tests or just different analyses that would bear upon his argument, that would be supportive of it?
There's really not much evidence supportive of Dr. Feingold's position. There's better evidence, I think, in support of the sugar metabolism. Because looking at some of the hyperactive children, what you find is that there's a rapid metabolism of the sugar. So at one point in the day, they eat something very rapidly. The sugar gets into their bloodstream more rapidly than other children. And then there's a rapid depletion of the sugar. So that they're high on sugar and then extremely low on sugar in their bloodstream. The other interesting thing is that there's also a high rate of alcoholism in the families of hyperactive children, and we're starting to hear arguments now about alcoholism being related to sugar metabolism. So right now I feel like there's more support for the sugar metabolism idea than for Dr. Feingold's food additives.
But the more you know, the more puzzling it becomes.
It becomes very, very complicated. I'm at a point right now where I think there are probably hyperactive children that are due to lead poisoning, fluorescent lighting, child rearing, environmental trauma, food additives, metabolism, genetics, and probably 6 other things. So we've got a very complex phenomena occurring that manifests itself mainly in children not being able to learn adequately in school and bothering people.
Richard Snyder.
You were talking about, pardon me, the sugar problem, and I was thinking there are diabetics and there's hypoglycemia, sort of opposite ends of the thing. Could there be an opposite to hyperactivity, something that might be called hypoactivity or something like that?
Yes, there is a condition that's called hypoactive, a hypoactive child. And this is a child who sits, and you talk to him, and he sits. And he doesn't seem to learn anything from you, or very much from you. He just seems to sit. He may kind of fiddle with his hands or something like this. But he's very underactive. And many people feel like that he's kind of the opposite pole of the hyperactive in chemistry.
There's one other thing, if I may. I'm very interested in children in classrooms and things like that. Is there something that a teacher can do if there's a hyperactive child, or perhaps for some teachers more than one, in a classroom? Is there something they can do? Can they quiet these children down?
Let me start with the basic classroom in our society first, okay? If you go into if you go into classrooms today, you'll still find many classrooms that are set up with these nice, neat little rows of chairs. Now, the reason we have that kind of classroom is because it's cheap. You know, it's the most economical use of space. You line everybody up in these nice, neat little rows, and you get maximum use out of the space. But that classroom is not designed for these little people that we call hyperactive. Because what does it do? Well, it puts a little girl with long hair next to me on this side, and it puts another noisy little boy, next to me on this side. It puts somebody right in front of me and some right in back of me. So what happens is if I can't deal with a lot of stimulation, I've got these four people, doing something with me or interacting with me all the time, and, I'm getting higher and higher and more problem because of the stimulation I'm getting. So one of the things a teacher can do immediately is to break up the classroom in a way that reduces the stimulation for this hyperactive child or number of hyperactive children. And you can do that by hauling in old bookcases or something and making the room into maybe 4 little units with 2 here and 3 here and 4 here and so on. So you break up the typical kind of classroom is one of the first things. I think the second thing would be to structure the room more, and to structure things for this little boy more carefully, or this little girl, if it's a little girl, so that they know exactly what they have to do. They get rewards more rapidly for doing what they're supposed to do. You just develop a much tighter, more controlled environment for them.
Can I pursue one more thing? I've heard you referring to hyperactive children, and with only a couple of instances as exceptions, you keep calling hyperactive kids he.
Yes.
And I have to confess, I know there's a little pet idea back in behind this. Would you tell us about it?
Well, the ratio of boys to girls is about, almost everyone agrees it's at least 5 to 1 in favor of little boys, that they're much more frequent in being called hyperactive. Some teachers in a classroom will even say that there's 50% of their little boys that are hyperactive. Now, I think there may be something wrong if there's someone saying there's 50% of little boys that are hyperactive. There's something wrong with the structure, I would suggest. But it does seem that there are a lot more little boys that are labeled hyperactive. Now, one of the notions behind that is little boys are taught to be more aggressive. And what gets you into trouble in a hurry in a social environment is being physically aggressive, hurting other children. And the hyperactive boys are likely to be hurting other children. They're likely to pound on them. And the interaction of a little hyperactive boy is likely to be something like this. Will you play with me? No, I don't want to play with you. I'll beat you up if you don't. Go ahead. So the little hyperactive boy proceeds to beat the kid up to get him to play with him. All that means is the little boy won't come back the next week. Now, little girls in our society typically have been very different from that. You can take a little girl by the time she hits first grade, and you can say, now, on your honor, will you stand here in the corner for an hour? And lots of little girls will stand in the corner for an hour simply because you tell them to. We train them differently, it seems to me. And we train them not to be as physically aggressive. So I think that's one of the reasons why not so many of them are labeled hyperactive. They're not as physically aggressive. Now, I think that's about to change. We're training women now in our society to be more aggressive and to be more physically aggressive. And if you look at the crime against another person, that means physical assault of some kind, you'll find that women are increasing at a very rapid rate in their assaults on other people. So it seems to me that we're training the little girls now to be more aggressive. That means we'll probably have more little girls in the future that will be called hyperactive.
Dorothy Schneider.
I'd like to go back along the educational lines a little bit. Other than just the teacher structuring the classroom, what other educational facilities or services would you think would be most beneficial for these kids? I'm thinking, should they be separated from other children, or should they be incorporated in the regular classroom?
Whenever possible, I would agree with Dr. Glasser. I know something of Dr. Glasser's philosophy, and I'd say they ought to be kept in the regular classroom. They shouldn't be separated. They're feeling dumb and like they're failures anyway, and a lot of them are very bright kids. So you take them out and kind of make a special case out of them, and they're going to feel more left out, more like they don't belong. So I personally feel like they ought to be dealt with right in the classroom, not removed. But that does mean you have to train teachers to cope with them. That means you have to teach teachers to cope with themselves. They have to be in control. So I think we have to do a better job maybe of training our teachers. Now, when you look at the number of children who are being called hyperactive, you're talking about 1 child in 20, 5% of the population of children are being labeled hyperactive. That means there's probably at least one in every classroom in the United States that's being labeled that. But we're not preparing our new teachers, our old teachers, to deal very effectively with that problem. And we've got to do that.
Dr. Atwood, there is another psychologist that's certainly well known, that's written in the whole area for all age groups in life and the philosophy of life, Dr. Jess Lair, who taught at the University of Minnesota and then later at Montana State University. In one of his books, he said, in relation to what you've been talking about, that he believes that one of the great problems for teenagers and adults, both, in their inability to relate to other people and therefore to turn to violence or whatever, is the lack of affection and love and being cared for when they were very young, especially in the first 2, 3, or 4 years. And he's speaking particularly of a very close affection and being held a lot and told that they were loved. How would you react to this in relation to the hyperactive child? Do you believe that there are data available to indicate this might be?
I don't think there's very clear-cut evidence that that would be the case, but again, from my personal experience, I'd say that there's some hyperactive children that are probably that way because they didn't receive love and affection when they were small. Now, if you don't receive love and affection, do you really ever learn to empathize with other people, to understand? So if I haven't had the experience of being loved and so on, I may stab another little boy with a pencil and really never appreciate what I've done because I can't empathize and kind of get into his skin and feel what it's like to be stabbed by another child. So yes, I think there are children probably that are hyperactive because they haven't had the love and affection that they need, and they haven't learned to empathize or understand the relationships between people.
Then if that goes beyond a certain stage, then and if that were to be the case, can that be corrected, or does one pass beyond a point where it would be too late?
Well, I think that it's very difficult to change that once a child gets into young adulthood. I think it's very difficult to change. I think there are a lot of people in our prisons who basically are there because of what you've described. And you look at the success rate we're having with trying to rehabilitate this particular group of people, our success rate is terrible. People go into prison, go back in, go back in. We really don't do much of a job of rehabilitating.
Thank you. Maybe Reed.
Well, what's it like to be a sibling in a home? I see all sorts of interpersonal questions that come up. The parents must have extra stresses. What's it like to be a brother or sister?
Terrible.
Terrible.
Terrible for a number of reasons. One is everyone in the block knows that you have a little hyperactive child in your home, and they're saying, "Oh, you've got a terrible, sibling." And so the neighborhood's down on the family often because of this sibling. The other thing is the child is so destructive frequently that the parents have to spend all of their time with the hyperactive child, and so the other children lose out, in a sense, on the time with the parents. The other thing is that the children can't have anything nice, the other children. So if it's a young teenage girl, she goes and spends some of her money and buys some nice makeup or something she really enjoys, comes home, and the lipstick's been dug in with a toothpick. It's destroyed. So it's very hard for siblings to be in a home with a hyperactive child.
Is this destructiveness always there? Is this just a general characteristic?
Usually there's a lot of destructive behavior. That's one of the things that gets them labeled, is the destructiveness.
And so they'll hit out both at people and at things. And
Yes.
so it would be... well, have there been any studies done on what happens to these siblings? Do they seem to copy the behavior? I mean, if you're a younger sister or brother, would you tend to copy?
Well, there are just a lot of homes where there's only one hyperactive child. So a lot of them don't copy. Okay? There are other siblings, but they don't develop the hyperactivity. So there are a lot of homes where that doesn't occur. There are some homes where you run into a situation where the next younger child will, at least at some point, start copying the hyperactive child to try and get his share of attention. Often they'll stop after a while because they don't like the negative attention, and they're more able to get positive attention than the hyperactive child, so they'll revert back to the positive ways of getting attention.
Is there some question of whether or not the hyperactive child can actually discern the difference between the positive and negative? You have said that they do respond to positive treatment, but their judgment is a little bit less sound.
It really seems like they're defective in responding to both rewards and punishments. They can discriminate them, but they don't seem to respond in the same, at least intensity, that other children do to rewards and punishments. So if you watch the parent trying to deal with this hyperactive child, and so when he's 2 years old, he writes on the wall. Now, if I've just got through painting, usually I get very frustrated when a child does that. And I have this thing in the back of my head that says a good parent spanks when a child really does something very bad. So I spank the child. 2 minutes, he's back writing on the wall again. I spank him harder. 2 minutes later, he's back on doing it again. I spank him harder. And if he keeps frustrating me, I'm likely to abuse him seriously because I can't control my feelings. Still doesn't seem to work. That kind of punishment does not seem to work very well with them. The interesting thing is when you give them amphetamines or stimulants, punishment starts working almost immediately. They start feeling sad for things they've done. In fact, one of the side effects of stimulant drugs on about 15% of the hyperactive children is they weep. They become depressed. They feel guilt-ridden, which is really such a dramatic change in their behavior, and suggests that now for the first time they're able to feel some of the effects of punishment and the guilt that goes along with punishment.
Richard Snyder.
Has anyone ever, tried therapy in restraining a hyperactive child?
Probably one of the most controversial persons who does some restraining therapy is a Dr. Zaslow from California. And he has a particular kind of therapy. His approach to the hyperactive child is that the child has buffaloed the mother. The mother has never become boss in the family. And so this child is always in control, but doesn't like it. But he's in control of the mother. He's kind of out of control, but at least he's in control of the mother. So Zaslow's idea is to get the mother back in control of dealing with this child. So what he will do with the parents watching is stretch his child across the laps of several people, hold the child down, and then stimulate the child. Throw him into a temper tantrum. And then they'll talk to him and say, "Who's boss?" And the little boy will say, "I am." And then they'll stimulate him some more and they'll say, "What's 2 and 2?" He'll say, 10. Very defiant. And they'll keep doing this for hours sometimes until finally you see this little boy that seemed to be completely out of control, and he's just kind of limp like this. And you say, "What's 2 and 3?" And he'll say, 5. "Who's boss?" "You are." And he's had some very dramatic results sometimes in dealing with these children that seem to be out of control.
And this is a sort of breaking of the child's will.
It almost appears like that, you have been in control, now the adult's going to be in control, and we're going to stay here until we are.
Do you find much credence in this approach, you personally?
Well, I think if you're talking about a child who has become the controlling agent in a family, whether it's caused by brain damage or anything else, if he's controlling all the behavior of the rest of the family, I think you can treat it in this way and have some success. You can say, the parent's finally going to be the one that's going to be back in control of the situation. Now, he's not going to wake up after you get through the 2-hour treatment and be a perfect child, but you're probably going to have more control over him, a little more control over his behavior.
Dorothy Schneider.
Some of the behaviors of the children you've been talking about seem to be characteristic of emotionally disturbed children. Could you distinguish between the hyperactive child and the emotionally disturbed?
Well, again, I think one of the things I've been trying to say to you is I don't know really what a hyperactive child is. So it'd be very difficult for me to discriminate and say, the hyperactive child is different than an emotionally disturbed child. In fact, I really don't like the word sometimes emotionally disturbed child. I'd rather talk about children having problems and different kinds of problems. And in fact, I think it'd probably be a good idea if we did away with the label hyperactive and simply said, here's a child that's having these problems. Let's see what we can do about them. Now, there are some children who are quite different than what we're describing tonight. There are some children who have nightmares all the time. We have children who are terrified of almost everyone and everything. We have little children who don't develop language and have some really crazy ideas. They have hallucinations even and delusions. And I think that's quite different than the children we're talking about. But which one of them is mentally ill? The ones we're talking about tonight or these others? I'd sort of say they both have problems. They're different kinds of problems. And maybe forget about both the labels.
Dr. Atwood, I'd like to take advantage of your expertise while you're here and talk about something else that we certainly should give an entire program to sometime in the future, and that is the question of child abuse. And you alluded to that a minute ago in relation to something else. Oftentimes we discuss in our society what child abuse is, and I would like to get your opinion. Is this any type of contact by the parents with the child in which there would be physical punishment, or does it have to go to a certain extreme when there is certain injuries to the child that are very serious? How would you define child abuse is what I'm asking.
I guess I'd define child abuse as when the parents are frequently either physically or psychologically hurting the child, and the parents seem to be kind of out of control of their feelings in dealing with this child or the environment around them. They kind of take out their frustrations on the child. I think most of us lose control once in a while and really physically abuse our children. They push us, or circumstances push us to a point where we hit them or do some things that normally we wouldn't do, or we say something like, I wish you'd go away, and get run over by a car. Those seem to be very normal feelings. But some parents are having those feelings so frequently that the life and the health of the child are really at stake. So you find them kicking children downstairs because of their frustration and so on. You find them, one father that I remember used to hang the child up over the door. He'd get so angry at the child, he'd put a bell around the child's feet, hang the bell up over the top of the door, and then close it, and then open the door, and the child would fall on its head on the floor. Now, you know, it's apparent that you can physically injure a child, produce brain damage and all kinds of other things with that behavior. So when it's happening frequently and there's serious blows, either physical or psychological, some mothers don't like their children. They don't like children, period. Some fathers don't. And they may say repeatedly to a child, I hate you, I wish you'd go away. That's child abuse in my way of thinking. If that's repeated enough times, the child's going to feel worthless, and it's going to eventually destroy him, I would think, or her.
Let's take that one step further then and get your viewpoints also on the parent that continually either physically or psychologically abuses the child. What are some of the psychological explanations why a parent will engage in this continually?
Well, let's say that you're frustrated. And you're upset and you're angry. Who would you hit first, me or your 8-year-old, if you have one? So I think one of the things that's going on, one of the reasons children get beat on so frequently, is because they can't fight back. So they're a safe target in many ways to strike. We've also had, I think, an idea in our culture that children are pieces of property, that they're ours. We can do anything we want to them as parents. And we tend to look at it in that way. So it's okay to beat my child. He's mine. He's my piece of property. The other thing I think that's going on is simply that there are so many pressures in our society right now that it's very difficult for us to stay calm and collected and tranquil. And children present lots of problems. We think of them sometimes when we're young. We think, oh, we're going to have this lovely little child, and it'll make our home happy, and everything will go fine as soon as we have this little child in our home. And then we have the child, and it gets us up at 2 o'clock every morning for the first 6 months, and it cries, and it does all these things. And then it starts talking back to us when it gets a little older and saying, you know, I don't like you, I don't believe what you say, Dad and Mother. And all the time we've thought that, you know, we were ideal parents and that we ought to be able to handle this child so they would grow up respecting us. And now they're saying we don't respect you, or at least that's the way we feel. If they don't obey us immediately and completely, we get frustrated and act out on it.
Thank you. Mary Lou Reed.
Dr. Atwood, what kind of job do you think our school system is doing in providing an education for these young people? Do you have an alternative system, or do you think we should have more variety so that children should not perhaps be put into such stressful situations?
I don't think you can really make a general statement about our schools, because I go in schools and I go in classrooms that I think, you know, they're providing 20 opportunities in one classroom. They are really doing a great job. They can handle all the kids in that particular classroom. And then I go in others where I just kind of shake my head and say, dear, couldn't it be better than this? I think that we need to look carefully at some of the sex differences that we have, little boys versus little girls, and look at maybe how could we fit the need of little boys better and the needs of little girls better, and look at those differences. I don't think we've looked very carefully at those. We find that most of the models for grade school are women, and I think maybe we ought to look at getting more men teachers involved in the system Sometimes I've wondered about delaying little boys going to school. There's a great fervor right now about, getting back to basics. You teach reading and writing and arithmetic, and people are seeing that as an alternative. Boy, if you go back to some of the early testing data in the 1940s and see how many young men couldn't read when they hit the Army entrance exams, you'll find that we're probably doing a better job now than we were in 1945 in teaching the three basics, as well as a lot of other things. There are some children who are very difficult to teach. I think it has a lot to do, in many cases, to do with the kind of family units they come from, the communities they come from. They haven't learned to live in our standard classroom. So rather than change dramatically our school system from 1 to 12, it seems like to me that probably what we ought to do is take some of these children earlier and start stimulating them so that by the time they get ready for school, or by the time they hit first grade, they're more ready to deal with the curriculum we have there. And let me give you a study about that. There was a study done in one of the larger cities on the East Coast, where they found mothers with IQs of 60 and below. These were measured IQs. Then, as they had their children, they put part of the children in a control group and just let the mothers do what they usually do with them. And then they took the other group and from birth put them in this stimulating environment, in kind of daycare centers where they're really stimulated. By the time the children hit first grade, the children who had the stimulating environment had an IQ that averages the same as entering freshmen in college, 115. The children who did what the mothers normally did with them had an average IQ of 40. And I say, well, gee, how could you have that dramatic difference? Well, these mothers who did the usual thing with their children were usually single parents. They had to make a living, and they're the kind of women who wanted to make a living. They didn't want it handed out to them. They wanted to make a living for themselves. So they're working as some kind of domestic. They made just barely enough money to get along. And so they couldn't afford babysitters. So what did they do with their children? They put them in the safest place that they knew of, and that was in the crib in the bedroom. So they locked them in the crib during the day and went to work. So the child was without stimulation for most of their developmental years. It's something we need to change, I think.
Would you then be a strong advocate, or are you a strong advocate for daycare centers in order to normalize situations?
Yes, and we need to start them early with children who are kind of deprived. We can't wait until they're 5.
Like early, do you think as early as 18 months and 2?
A year.
A year?
Yes, as early as that.
Now that's a very expensive kind of proposition.
Now, is it? You have to look at that in terms of long-run benefits.
In terms of crime?
If I have to keep a person in an institution, it's going to cost me between $10,000 and $15,000 a year probably to keep them in an institution. How much does it cost to run a good daycare center per child? Does it cost $10,000? I'd say it doesn't. Okay. You can probably do it for significantly less than that.
Richard Snyder.
Well, I have 2 things I'm thinking about. One, do hyperactive children ever grow up and live normal lives? And secondly, do you know of any relationship between hyperactivity as a child and criminality as an adult?
Well, there are some children that grow up that are called hyperactive when they're little that grow up to be very successful people. And every time I teach a class in hyperactivity, I meet 2 or 3 of my students in the class that were labeled hyperactive when they were little, and they're very successful people. The tragedy is that many of them who were labeled hyperactive don't make it. And so if you're labeled hyperactive as a child, you have about 6 times a greater chance ending up in an institution as a child who's not labeled that. So especially for the boys, the outcome's not that rosy. Now that's before we had a lot of the medications we're currently giving them. These are statistics that were basically before the medication, so I don't know how that's going to affect things. Little girls fare much better. Little girls, in spite of the label of hyperactivity, learn to read, which little boys don't learn to do frequently. They're accepted better by their peers, which little boys aren't. And so the girls tend to fare much better and have a much higher success ratio than the little boys.
So this is a real thing financially then, because you're saying that if we don't take care of these kids as kids, we may have to take care of them as adults at $10,000 or $15,000 a year.
That's right. That's right. So it depends on which time you want to spend the money, and you're probably going to spend more if you have to let them spend it any length of time in an institution.
Dorothy Schneider.
You mentioned the non-readers during World War II.
Mm-hmm.
Do I understand then that this is a problem that's always been with us? It's just now that we're beginning to label it?
Well, the non-reader's always been with us. Hyperactivity, the thing we call hyperactivity, has also always been with it. It seems to be on the increase, however. But there are children who have had a very difficult time reading for a long, long time. They've had a difficult time learning how to read. And we've tried lots of ways to teach them. And one of the best reading teachers that I know of lately said, I can't teach this little boy how to read. I've done everything I know how. I simply can't teach him how to read. So we've had them with us for a long, long time. Now, in the past, what have they been able to do? So you can stay out on the farm. Now, there aren't many farms to work on. If I go to some other countries, if I can't read, I can go out and work on a farm. Can't do that in our culture.
Dr. Atwood, I have a question that you need 30 minutes on, and you have about a minute and a half.
Okay.
It seems to me, in my experience in teaching in colleges, that students really change about every 10 years, a decade. The students of the 70s are not like the students of the 60s, and there's many characteristics that show that. My question is, why do we have such a change from apparently one decade to the other one in attitude and even what they're majoring in and so forth?
Well, I haven't observed the big changes you're talking about. That's not part of my experience. They seem to not be that different to me. Now, sometimes there are causes they can rally around and feel, and that changes their behavior for a period of time, I think. But I haven't seen them as being that different. There's some changes that I think older people don't understand in some of the younger people that are coming out of our schools now, and it has to do with an orientation toward money. If I talk to my parents, they're very concerned about money because that had been a major issue as they grew up. Now, many of the children who've grown up in the last 20 years haven't had to be concerned about that. They've had the necessities with no problem. And so they've been concerned with other issues.
I just wish we could pursue that. We could really get into discussion, but time has caught us once again. On behalf of the panel, Dr. Atwood, it's certainly been a real pleasure having you on the program, and I know our viewing audience at this point has come to the conclusion that it's been most informative about a very important subject. Thank you.
It's been fun. I've enjoyed it.
I also thank our panel for outstanding questions. Ladies and gentlemen, our guest has been Dr. Robert Atwood, who is a professor of clinical psychology at Eastern Washington State College, and in addition to that is a consultant. I want to invite you to be with us again next week when we'll be interviewing another personality of the United States. And until then, good evening.
The North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at this same time each week over this station. The preceding student production was brought to you by videotape recording.